Good afternoon, and welcome to the City Club of Portland's Friday Forum. I'm Pat McCormick, President of the City Club, and I'd like to welcome members and guests alike, those of you who are joining us here today in the Governor Hotel, those of you listening on OPB Radio, or watching on Portland Community Media's CityNet 30. Today we will discuss student debt, its effects on our nation, and the policy options to address this issue. But first, some announcements. The generous support of City Club's corporate and media partners ensures that we put on the state's best civic programs week after week. I'd like to thank our media partners, including Oregon Business Magazine, and our Friday Forum winter corporate sponsors, Bank of the Cascades, CenturyLink, Miller Nash, Regents Blue Cross Blue Shield of Oregon, and The Standard. We're grateful for your support and commitment to City Club's mission. Please join me in a warm round of applause for all of them. Tickets are on sale and going fast, I might add, for Congressman Earl Blumenauer's speech next Friday, February 22nd, titled Beyond the Fiscal Cliff. When's the last time you went to the Portland Art Museum? Why not join the New Leaders Council on Thursday for a tour of the current photography exhibit by Carrie Mae Weems, 3 Decades of Photography. You can learn more about City Club events on our website, pdxcityclub.org. We will be having a question and answer session with the panel at the end of today's program. Members, please come to the microphone, which is located over here today, to ask your question. For all of our audience members, please locate the index cards at the center of your tables and write your questions on them during the forum. We will collect them prior to the start of the Q&A period. And now, our program. As Oregon and other states have dramatically reduced the level of state support for public higher education, tuition at public universities as well as private institutions has skyrocketed. Oregon students now graduate from our public universities with an average of $25,000 in debt. Today, our speakers will describe the causes and the magnitude of student debt, review our most promising federal policy options, and tell us about a bold new method to finance public higher education in Oregon called Pay It Forward. Nathan Hunt is a senior at Portland State University studying political science and economics. He resides in Woodburn with his wife Courtney and his son Mason. Mary C. King is a professor of economics at Portland State University, specializing in labor economics with a strong interest in policy issues. And Ariel Groover, who will speak first, is a senior at Portland State University pursuing a bachelor's degree in economics with a minor in mathematics and statistics. She also works full-time in foreign exchange services at Wells Fargo Bank. After graduation, she's interested in beginning graduate studies and pursuing a career in international development. Without further ado, let me introduce our panel and begin our presentation for the day.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for giving us your time and attention today. My name is Ariel Groover, and I am an economics major at Portland State University. Professor Mary King, Nathan, and I are part of a group called Students for Educational Debt Reform. We began in a newly offered senior capstone course last fall titled Student Debt, Economics, Policy, and Advocacy. This course was co-taught by Professor King, who is speaking here today, as well as Professor Barbara Dudley, who is a member of the Portland City Club. This capstone course allowed us to explore the developing role of student debt in the pursuit of a college degree, the evolution of federal and legislative policies in effect, and the likely future if we continue on the path of disinvestment in higher education. Alongside our community partners, Jubilee Oregon and Working Families Organization, we were able to advocate for policy reform, gain public and political support, and produce a final report and legislative hearing at the end of the term. Today, I will begin by discussing the national context of the student debt crisis. Professor King will discuss the situation here in the state of Oregon, and Nathan will conclude with our suggestions for reform. I have always valued education highly. It is an essential social freedom that can help lift individuals from poverty and improve the quality of one's life by allowing them to become productive members of the society in which they live. As a first-generation college student, I am determined in my academic pursuit. I am currently a full-time student at Portland State University. In addition, every week I work close to 40 hours in order to earn a salary that will cover my housing, transportation, and other necessary living expenses. Whatever income remains, after these bills are paid, I save, sometimes for unexpected expenses or additional educational costs, but most importantly, I save for the principal and interest payments on my student loans that are coming due upon graduation. I am currently in my final year of undergraduate studies and have acquired just under $25,000 in student loans. The majority of these loans is unsubsidized and have accrued interest throughout my entire college career. I am incredibly grateful to have a job that provides me a salary above minimum wage. I know that I am one of the few among my large network of peers who are able to enjoy this benefit. However, as lucky as I have been, and as well prepared as I strive to be, I cannot say that the financial burden of my educational debt has had no effect on my post-graduation plans. I am one of a large proportion of recent and future graduates who have a very troublesome obligation ahead, one which prioritizes itself above all of our future career and academic aspirations. It has come to be well recognized as a nationwide student debt crisis. We are all too familiar with the state of the national economy. Since 2007, unemployment rates have surged, reaching an annual national average of nearly 10% in 2010. Since then, and despite relentless efforts of the US government and the Federal Reserve, we have seen only minor reductions to this rate, with a national average in 2012 at just over 8%. Though this may seem as substantial progress, it cannot seem to come quickly enough in order to help our nation make full recovery from such a lasting recession. The effects of unemployment are felt particularly severely by today's young adults, who make up a large portion of the unskilled labor sectors in our economy. In both economic recessions and expansions, the unemployment rate for young workers under the age of 25 is typically around twice as high as the overall unemployment rate. Therefore, when our economy is in a recession, young adults are hit the hardest. Most recent data from January of this year reveals that unemployment rates for workers under the age of 25 is nearly 15%. With very few entry-level positions in today's labor market, it is no wonder why today's youth look to higher education as a means to a more promising future. Not only is the number of entry-level positions severely limited, but they are also becoming more demanding of their considerable job applicants than ever before. In such a competitive job market, positions one would think of as ideal for the inexperienced, such as retail, customer service, telemarketing, and manufacturing, now require considerable work experience and oftentimes even a college degree. And these jobs, at best, pay little more than the minimum wage. By no means are these opportunities that lay a guaranteed path for one who hopes to achieve middle income salary. Yet in today's economy, these are the opportunities most available to, and yet increasingly unattainable for, today's young adults. Never before has it been so essential to pursue higher education and a college degree in order to achieve the American dream. Unfortunately, upon realizing such necessity, high school graduates face a binding decision of how to finance their educations. As more and more students decide to pursue higher education, there are fewer viable options to finance educational expenses, resulting on a greater dependency on student loans to cover the upfront costs. This problem is growing substantially, with nearly $900 billion in federal loans and approximately $150 billion in private loans. Student debt in America now exceeds $1 trillion. From 2007 to 2011, the amount of total outstanding student debt increased by nearly 50%. More is now owed in student debt than is owed in credit card debt in the US. college graduates from all across the country are experiencing the effects of excessive student debt. Recent data from 2011 reveals that approximately 2/3 of students who earn four-year bachelor's degrees are graduating with an average student loan balance of more than $25,000. And 1 in 10 borrowers now owe more than $54,000 in loans due to accruing interest and fees. This is a tremendous financial burden to carry upon graduation. While an earlier graduate would be preoccupied with the excitement of pursuing their first real career opportunity fresh out of college, buying a home, and even starting a family, this is no longer possible for many. Today's graduates are preoccupied with the binding repayment terms of their student loans and desperate to secure a position merely to cover the loan payments as well as a meager allowance for the standard of living. And in today's job market, it's become no more welcoming to recent graduates. Though freshly educated, an applicant right out of college is perceived as inexperienced in today's competitive market. More likely than not, he or she will obtain a position outside of their specialty and well below their desired, or rather necessary, range of pay in order to cover all the required expenses and student loan payments. In addition to high unemployment, students today face a number of other obstacles that make it all the more difficult to get ahead. Low wages, high housing costs, lack of affordable health insurances, all add to the challenges of skyrocketing student debt. Since 2000, the cost of education has more than doubled, yet real wages earned by young people have fallen by nearly 12%. Half of Americans aged 25 to 34 are spending more than 30% of their income on housing alone. The combination of lower wages and increased cost of living has led more Americans to rely on credit to cover month-to-month costs and pay other maturing debts. Credit card debt held by those under the age of 35 has increased by more than 80% since 1989. This combination of unlucky circumstances has created the precise climate for significant loan defaults. Default rates among federal student loans have been increasing steadily over the last 10 years. Today, nearly 10% of borrowers are defaulting on their federal loans within only 2 years of entering the repayment period. The percentage represents nearly 400,000 of more than 4 million borrowers who entered into repayment in 2010. A default is declared once a borrower has missed a payment for 270 consecutive days, nearly 9 months without making a single payment. And the rates only increase with time. Nearly 14% of borrowers have defaulted on federal loans within 3 years of entering repayment. Where will the same group stand in the next 5 years? The statistics are not promising, and private loans tell a similar story. Total balances of private loans in default now exceed $8 billion and represent nearly 100 million individual loans. As you can see, this is not just a case of outliers, but a large group of young individuals becoming entirely consumed by debt. In order to understand the creation of the student debt crisis, we must look at the evolution of the federal policies in our recent history. Traditionally, the federal and the state governments have had a shared responsibility for funding higher education. While state governments hold responsibility for operating costs and public institutions, the federal government provides the financial aid. The federal government is a primary source of public grants, subsidized and unsubsidized loans. One of the largest federal grants, known as the Pell Grant, is a need-based grant for which eligibility is determined on the basis of income. The Pell Grant has provided invaluable opportunities for students from lower socioeconomic backgrounds who may have otherwise been unable to pursue higher education. When the Pell Grant was initially introduced in 1973, it covered the entire cost of tuition, as well as additional expenses for books and other course materials. Today, the maximum Pell Grant is less than $5,000, while average tuition costs at public universities now exceed $8,000, and this is not including other expenses for books and course fees. Due to this discrepancy, Pell Grant recipients today are twice as likely as other students to rely on student loans. In 2011, Congress was facing an enormous budget crisis. the option to reduce funding for the Pell Grant, as well as double interest rates on all federal loans, was under serious consideration. Fortunately, students from around the country made their voices heard and came together to save the Pell Grant from severe reduction. This, however, is unlikely to be the last time we are called on to defend the funding for the Pell Grant. Future congressional sessions will be searching for spending cuts, and higher education is a likely candidate for such cuts. Over the last 30 years, Congress has moved decisively to shift the majority of financial aid from grants to federal loans. When the Pell Grant was first introduced, federal aid included approximately equal amounts of grants and loans, and in many years issued more grants than loans. Today, federal aid provides more than 6 times as many loans as grants to students who are looking to obtain a college degree. State governments have significantly disinvested in public higher education as well. In 2001, U.S. states provided public universities an average of approximately $9,000 per full-time student, which dropped to an average of just over $6,000 in 2011. That's a 42% decrease in real funding over a 10-year time frame. During the same period, average tuition for public universities increased by nearly 50%. Consequently, the financial burden of higher education has shifted suddenly and entirely onto the students. The depletion of federal and state funding has, however, enormously benefited private lending agencies. As students have come to rely more heavily on educational loans over time, private lenders are popping up all over the country to exploit the present generations of students struggling to get ahead. These loans are made readily and widely available, making them seem like a viable option to the young, inexperienced borrower. The problem is that private loans too often lead to immense long-term debt through high interest rates, hidden fees, and a significant lack of transparency in the terms of repayment. Private student loans offer no government protection to stop creditors from taking advantage of the borrower, leaving the students at the mercy of the creditor. The threat of default is ineffective. Many lending agencies have found that the rise in the rates of default on student loans actually increases total profits. Large lenders like Sallie Mae make higher profits on a loan in default than on one in which the borrower is making regular monthly payments. This strategy has destroyed any incentive for lending agencies to accommodate for a borrower facing financial hardships. And for graduates who reach a point of considering bankruptcy, you must know this is not an option. Before 2005, students could file bankruptcy as a means to escape excessive burden of private education loans. Shortly thereafter, the so-called Bankruptcy Abuse Prevention and Consumer Protection Act extended non-dischargeability to all educational loans. I would like to make it clear that student loans are one of the very few debts, besides child support, that cannot be discharged through bankruptcy. So not only is student debt inescapable through bankruptcy, but student loans have no statute of limitations, and collectors can garnish wages, unemployment benefits, and Social Security payments in order to cover repayment. If you haven't yet found this troublesome, then I ask you this now. How can we expect today's youth to become tomorrow's leaders, or even simply productive members of society, if they become overwhelmed with such strenuous financial burdens so early on in their adult life? This is a problem that has been building at a reckless pace and can no longer afford to be overlooked. Growing student debt poses serious consequences, both socially and economically, of which we cannot afford to leave future generations to face alone. Now, please welcome Professor King, who will discuss the situation here in the state of Oregon. Thank you.
Thank you, Ariel. And thanks to all of you for coming out today and bringing us your time and attention to this really pressing issue. I'm Mary King. I'm a labor economist on the faculty at Portland State here, and it's my responsibility today to tell you particularly about the situation in Oregon. Let me start with the local benefits to the broader public of investment in higher education. We often forget that there are public as well as individual benefits when students pursue university degrees. It's true that the individual benefits are significant. Graduates earn higher wages, they experience lower unemployment rates, they report greater life satisfaction and better health outcomes, and of course, we hope they learn something. I do have to admit the caveat that the Great Recession, as you've heard from Ariel, has meant that real wages for young college graduates are at their lowest point in 15 years, and unemployment rates are relatively high. But regardless, it remains true that individual benefits from higher education are substantial. But it's also true that public, local benefits are substantial. There's a strong economic rationale for public investment in higher education. Economists view investment in education as investment in, quote, human capital. Investment in capital, originally conceived as buildings and machines, makes us more productive at work. An investment in human capital, capital embodied in people, acts just the same way, allowing people to create more value per hour worked, which is how economists define productivity. Investment in higher education has been responsible for a large chunk of economic growth in the U.S. over the 20th century. We've experienced clear gains from big policy initiatives like the GI Bill and public investments in the higher education systems like Oregon's. Berkeley economist Enrico Moretti is the preeminent researcher on social returns to higher education in local areas. He finds that as a higher proportion of the population in an area obtains a college degree, wages rise for the less educated. Costs related to crime fall, health outcomes improve, both for more educated adults and for their children, which increases well-being and lowers healthcare costs for all of us. And there's a payoff in terms of citizenship. A higher proportion of people inform themselves on political issues and more turn out to vote. Probably more join the City Club. In times such as the present, with a significant segment of the labor force still out of work, when we should be enacting policies to bring down unemployment and either forge or maintain people's connection to the labor force, increased investment in higher education is one of the best forms of stimulus spending available. There's an immediate impact and long-lasting effects on future productivity and economic growth. So it's a far better stimulus policy than something like a tax cut to propel the economy forward. So not only are there significant public benefits to educating a higher proportion of the population, it's also true that a higher proportion of the population in Oregon is seeking out higher education, given the very limited opportunities in the labor market for the high school educated. Enrollment in Oregon's universities and community colleges hit a historic high in 2010. It's dropped off a bit since, primarily for financial reasons. More students would enroll, but are at the limits of what they can pay and deterred by fear of debt, particularly among lower income and minority groups. But growth in enrollment has picked up speed, growing faster and faster over the past 30 years. Oregon is now much closer to the national norm in terms of its share of high school graduates under 25 who are enrolled in college. But growth in enrollment in higher education is not nearly sufficient to achieve the governor's very ambitious stated goal for education, encapsulated in the slogan 40-40-20 by 2025. What he means is that by 2025, we'd like to see 40% of adult Oregonians have a four-year college degree or more. The next 40% have a two-year associate's degree or the equivalent, and the remaining 20% a high school diploma, hence 40-40-20. In other words, if we add those two 40s together, 80% of adult Oregonians would have at least 2 years of college. Currently, only 56% of adult Oregonians have completed 2 years or more of college. Raising that number from 56% to 86% is a tremendous challenge to imagine meeting in the next 12 short years. If our political leadership in Oregon aspires to a more educated population, that ambition has not yet been reflected in funding. Oregon has rapidly and consistently been disinvesting in public higher education. Over the 20 years I've worked at PSU, the student body has doubled, but the number of tenure-track faculty in my department has fallen. It's no longer possible to earn a BA in economics in the evening in my department. The tenure-track faculty are under considerable pressure to find grants and contracts, to buy out their time, to replace themselves in the classroom with less expensive part-time faculty who may not be well integrated into the program or reliably available to students after the term in which they teach. We've hacked the library budget and subscriptions several times. We've added a number of student fees at PSU in addition to tuition increases, which have been substantial, 16% over the last biennium alone. There's a reason the students are up in arms down in Salem. Now, don't get me wrong. PSU has made a lot of progress as a university also over my career, and we have much to celebrate on that campus. But you can only do more with less to a certain point, at which you begin to do less with less. In the late 1980s, Oregon allocated 17% of its general fund to higher education. 20 years later, less than 6% goes to higher ed, though, as mentioned, we have many more students in the system. Now, it's true that states across the country have been cutting appropriations for higher education, but the situation is worse in Oregon. Even during the good years, before the 2008 recession, Oregon was cutting, while other states were increasing their investments. If you have the opportunity to hear my president, PSU's president, Wim Wiewel, speak, you'll hear him say that over the last 20 years, PSU has spent the same $11,000 annually to educate each full-time student. But whereas the state used to cover 70% of that cost and students 30%, those ratios have reversed. The state pays only 30% now. The burden is on the students for 70%. As a result, the Oregon University System reports that Oregon is 46th of 50 states when it comes to the affordability of our public universities. 46th out of 50. We don't usually think of ourselves as among the very worst. We have gorgeous scenery. Our local government works well. A high proportion of our kids are in public schools. Young college-educated people move here. We're on TV. And, you know, as for income and poverty rates, at least we're average. But our state level of funding for higher education is near rock bottom on a per-student basis. And with the cost shifted to students, college is increasingly unaffordable, despite the facts that Oregon public universities have faculty salaries that are much lower than our comparators, our student-faculty ratios are high, and we have a substantial backlog of deferred maintenance in our buildings. The result of being 46th of 50 in affordability is that our students work too many hours. Far too many work more than 20 hours a week, and a significant proportion are working full-time. You just cannot do justice to a college education that way. And far too many are going too far into debt. As Ariel said, the average graduate from public institutions in Oregon now carry $25,000 of debt. Last year, student loans increased 50%. This is a trend we must reverse. While $25,000 in debt is the average, of course there are students with much more, and that's before thinking about graduate school, which is not cheap. Student debt is a drag on the economy. It's a terrible burden on individuals. It prevents people from getting as much education as would be beneficial to themselves and society. It prevents recent grads from starting businesses, buying houses, or at least cars or furniture, from starting families. It prevents them from moving out of their high school bedrooms. What are we doing about this in Oregon? Most of our policy energy appears to be going into restructuring higher education administrative oversight. I don't want to say rearranging deck chairs on the Titanic, but it's hard to see that our most pressing priority is creation of new boards and agencies at this moment. One important initiative on the horizon Treasurer Ted Wheeler is proposing new bonding to better fund Oregon Opportunity Grants. That's Oregon's state program of financial aid for lower income students. Currently, only 20% of eligible students receive these grants, and the grants amount to less than $2,000 a year each, which is just over a fifth of tuition and fees. Treasurer Wheeler is advocating bonding to build a fund adequate for Oregon Opportunity Grants to be available to all eligible students for the first 2 years of college, but not, as I understand it, to increase the amount of the grants. This is absolutely critical and an initiative we can applaud, but it's not nearly on the scale of what's needed. Students in our fall capstone class on student debt have been advocating bolder policy action capable of arresting the crisis and downward spiral in which we find ourselves, something that we can do right here locally in the state, called Pay It Forward. It's a policy idea under consideration in several other states, and it's very similar to the way that Australia finances higher education. It would create debt-free public higher education by eliminating tuition and fees, replacing them with a binding obligation to pay into a fund that will effectively cover tuition and fees for an expanding number of students in the future. The state would need to maintain, or much better, increase investment in public higher education, but the student share could be paid as a manageable percent of income after education. And for more detailed understanding of this policy proposal, I'll turn it over to another PSU student, Nathan Hunt.
Good afternoon. This morning, my wife was explaining to our 3-year-old son that I'd be speaking in front of an audience today. He stood up straight, facing his imaginary audience, and said, "Attention, everyone, stay in your seats. My address today is about..." It was funnier when he said it. My address today is about getting a greater portion of the next generation into occupying seats within our state's universities and colleges. My name is Nathan Hunt. I'll be graduating from Portland State in June. By that time, I will have accumulated the average level of debt for student borrowers at PSU, about $25,000. I consider myself lucky. After all, few things that cost $25,000 deliver the benefit of a college education. I had the good fortune to avoid loans altogether until I was a junior. My grandparents were savers, and let it be known to all their grandchildren that if they had a will to go to college, help would be there. My situation offers a contrast to the problem many students face today. Their will to go to college is not met with adequate help. For students who are not able to secure scholarships, grants, or help from grandparents, loans are the means to a higher education. By accepting these loans, students accept risk that whatever benefit their college education delivers will be undermined by a burdensome debt. Many abandon their college aspirations in the face of accumulating such debts. However, more and more people are accepting that risk for the opportunities a college degree make available. Student debt is the only form of household debt to increase in the years following the economic collapse in 2008. In fact, according to the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, last quarter saw $42 billion added to outstanding student debt. Many in this protracted economic downturn were convinced that enrolling in college had become essential to securing a better footing in a future viewed as increasingly uncertain. Debt from student loans creates a double-edged sword, cutting away at the foundation of our economy, thus stalling an enduring recovery. Our economy needs to stand on a broad middle class, and that, in turn, requires a large number of people with college degrees. Debt is a necessary step toward gaining a college degree, dissuades many prospective students, and causes many graduates to fall short of their potential as professionals, consumers, and citizens. This problem has gained national attention. In the last session of Congress, a number of bills were introduced to address various parts of the dilemma. There were bills that addressed students and graduates with outstanding debts, including solutions such as capping the interest rates on student loans and the creation of a 10-year income-based repayment schedule for student borrowers with forgiveness of the balance remaining at the end. There were bills whose provisions included a shortened repayment schedule for graduates who enter public work and restoring bankruptcy protection to those who borrowed from private lenders. Our own Senator, Ron Wyden, introduced the Student Right to Know Before You Go Act in 2012, which would simply disclose to prospective students an estimate of their future income based upon the school they attend, their area of study, along with an estimate of how much debt the student could expect to accumulate. None of the bills introduced would have addressed the entire problem. Even enacting every bill would fall short of a comprehensive solution. But any one of the bills, if enacted, would have been a positive step toward remedying this problem of finance that has proven to be injurious to so many, which is why it pains me to say none of these pieces of legislation came close to passage. Clearly, our federal Congress has yet to find the determination needed to remedy this problem. Naturally, it follows that solutions are more likely to be enacted by the states. Our group, Students for Educational Debt Reform, proposed a state-based solution to a panel of legislators in December. The proposal, called Pay It Forward, would create a social insurance policy akin in some ways to Social Security. However, unlike Social Security, persons who receive benefits from the Pay It Forward program will pay into the program after benefits are received. The program will eliminate the need for students in Oregon's public colleges and universities to seek loans to pay for tuition by providing public higher education free of tuition and fees. In exchange, the student will sign a binding contract to pay the state a fixed percentage of their income or their adjusted gross income over a set number of years. In concert with the federal Pell Grant program and part-time work, many students will be able to afford all the expenses connected with a college education and forgo loans altogether. This will give rise to the type of expanded middle class our economy desperately needs. Our proposal suggests that for every academic year a student completes, or rather for every 45 credits earned, they pay the state 0.75% of their adjusted gross income. That means students who earn a bachelor's degree would pay 3% of their adjusted gross income for 24 years to build a fund capable of effectively paying the tuition and fees of an expanding group of students. Whether a graduate goes on to become an artisan or an engineer, their payments to the state will not present an unmanageable burden. This is not repayment on a loan. There's no interest accrued, just payment into a permanent education fund based on level of income. Some who consider this proposal will insist it is too expensive, claiming its benefits are not enough to justify such an investment. I remind those critics that the largest determinant of Oregon's economic health is the state of its middle class. More than ever before, entry into the middle class positively requires a college education. The Pay It Forward program will generate benefits we can all enjoy: middle class expansion, lower unemployment, increases in tax revenues, and reduction in government transfers. With access to college free of prohibited costs, more people will go to college and graduate with little to no debt. The growth of our educated workforce will be attractive to industry, and their higher level of disposable income will provide a boost to Oregon's business community. The fact that program benefits would be extended to recipients prior to their contributions into the fund does generate high costs in the early years of the program. Here I assert, the models we have been working with, created by the Economic Opportunity Institute in Seattle and Jason Gettle of the Oregon Center for Public Policy, show that the program is solvent in the long run. In the 5th year, we see the first cohort of graduates. From there, we see reductions in the net annual cost of the program. Between the 24th and 25th year, graduates' contributions into the fund exceed payments out of the fund. In year 28, the program is expected to see an annual surplus of $158 million. Subsequent years see nearly identical surpluses. So the program would require a sizable investment over the course of its first 24 years, but produce a self-sustaining fund to provide tuition-free college education to a growing number of Oregon residents. So the question is, How do we go about investing in this program during its early years? Issuing bonds seems to be a logical approach. This would be attractive to those individuals and institutions who are socially conscious, along with Oregon businesses that have an interest in cultivating the talents of our state's human resources. Another means to close this cost gap would be directing Oregon Opportunity Grant funds to pay it forward. Treasurer Wheeler has been a part of that conversation, and I'm pleased to announce that the conversation about Pay It Forward is about to involve many more participants. The House Committee on Higher Education has introduced a bill in this legislative session, House Bill 2838, which brings our proposal a step closer to a reality. Invariably, policymakers will discuss ways to minimize the cost. One less costly approach to implementing Pay It Forward would be starting with a pilot program, which could be done in a couple of ways. The limited spots in a pilot program could be made available to students enrolling in any of Oregon's post-secondary schools on a first-come, first-served basis. A second possibility would be designating a couple of pilot institutions, perhaps one 4-year and one 2-year school. Either way, the size of the upfront investment would be reduced, and valuable data would be gathered pertaining to the desirability and solvency of the program. Regardless of how this program would be implemented, the most important ingredient for success is that there be a will amongst Oregonians to solve this student debt crisis. That happens once it is recognized that college education is a public good. It's easy to find data on what benefits graduates get from their own education, and we would only have to look a little harder to find some data on the ways a graduate benefits the society as a whole. But there are many benefits graduates bestow on society that cannot be quantified. I see this kind of benefit all the time. In a college, even self-interested students are exposed to an atmosphere that promotes public interest. Many on their way to graduation unexpectedly find their passion in life. I went into school wanting to become an artist and make a visual contribution to society, but I wound up majoring in political science because making the world more just became my goal. Graduates free of debt are more able to be the persons they're meant to be. Professionally, they'll be able to do the work they're meant to do instead of the work they have to do. As I stated earlier, I'll graduate in June, and I feel lucky. Save the time they shared with me, the greatest gift from my grandparents was paving the way to a college education, and that will make graduation day truly sweet. My education will provide benefits to my family and I for a long time. I hope my education will also deliver benefits to many others. Every student should feel as positive as I do about graduating. That's possible, but it requires we meet their will to learn with the assistance it's due. This will ensure Oregon's best days are ahead of us. Thanks to Professor King and Ariel Groover and Barbara Dudley, and thanks to the City Club for the opportunity to speak here today. Everyone listening, thanks.
Thank you, Nathan and Ariel and Mary, for your presentations. Now, if you have a written question on an index card, please hold it up high so that City Club staff can collect it from you. Thank you. The first question for our speaker, as always, will be from today's Friday Forum host, Leslie Moorhead. Leslie is on the club's Board of Governors. She served as the club secretary from 2010 to 2012 and was named Member of the Year in 2010. Leslie?
Well, thank you, Pat. And to the panel, thank you. That's a fascinating presentation and a fascinating idea. It seems to me that whether a student has a huge loan to pay back starting, let's say, within the year after they leave college, or this new plan that you have, which would require them paying something out of their income, that the burden of students who graduate in this day and age is going to be significant for a long period of time. That means monthly or yearly payments for a good chunk of their working lives. The answer to that, if we're not going to reduce the cost of everything across the board, and that's a different public policy discussion, the answer is good jobs. The answer is jobs that are paying much more than the minimum wage. So the whole discussion here today is about benefiting higher education by bringing more students in and benefiting those students and ultimately society by graduating those students. But the cost of it is such a serious concern. So what is the university system doing to help students prepare for good jobs, go out and find good jobs, which I think are out there even in the depressed economy that we've had for quite a few years now? What is the university system doing to prepare students for everything from resume writing and interviewing skills all the way up to mentoring in the business community or the nonprofit community for jobs, and even choosing the right major in the first place for the jobs that are out there?
That's a good question. Thank you. I am happy to say that I do think considerable effort is being made in our public universities. Certainly Portland State's an example, through career planning and placement, through mentoring, through the University Studies, our undergraduate education program, through outreach into the departments, what can I do with this major, how can I get there, through really the considerable efforts of our alumni who come back to campus and work with students on a volunteer basis and reach out to try to help make those connections to get people into work. So I think you raise a really important point, and I am happy to say that I think there's considerable effort in that area.
We will now take questions from the floor. As always, we invite members to the microphone to ask their question. Asking questions at the Friday Forum microphone is a privilege of City Club membership, and membership is open to everyone. Before asking your question, please identify yourself as a City Club member and ask your question as directly as possible. If I flash the little question mark card, it means please wrap up your question. Carol?
Thank you, Pat. Carol Witherell, City Club member, and I want to thank you all for an incredible presentation, and the handouts were very helpful too. I learned a lot, and one of my questions is, you mentioned Australia funds student education and higher education in a similar way, and I wonder what you've learned from them in terms of what's working really well with that system and what kinds of problems or low impact or unanticipated consequences have they found? And a similar question with some of the other states that are considering it. What are you learning from them about their ideas?
I think that the Australia system, the major difference is that it is still conceived as a debt. And so people need to repay exactly that they have borrowed in the first place, which creates difficulty for people who experience hardship later in life, and also does not allow the state and the public to really reap to share with the fortunate what an income-based repayment gets. So that's, I think, the biggest thing that we've learned from the Australian system and how it might be improved. Really, I think the efforts in other states, to my knowledge, are not further advanced than Oregon. So we are learning more about how to analyze it, how to think about it, what the questions are, and what kinds of objections may be raised, but not yet anything that's experiential.
Hi, I'm Christine.
Oh, excuse me, just a moment.
I'm sorry, did you want to add something? Was there something you wanted to add?
Excuse me, go ahead.
Hi, I'm Christine McCants, City Club member, and I'm a student at Portland State studying both economics and public affairs and policy. The side of me that is policy oriented has a lot of questions about implementation and process, and I'm not going to ask you those questions right now, but with a lot of considerations about how do you collect from people who move internationally, and how would you distribute the funds, and how would it be administered. I guess my question for you is, where are you in that process? Is your group intending to try and flesh out some of those policies, or is your intention to kind of get a broad idea and then hand it over to stakeholders to figure it out?
I always thought details like that, if we did get the attention of legislators, those would be the details they'd hash out. Someone did say, within every university you do have a department of financial aid. So if people weren't financing their education anymore, you'd have personnel there. And so, I don't know though, that would be, whatever we would offer to legislators, I'm sure wouldn't stay intact.
Ariel?
And also to add to that, to answer your question, yes, we've just more discussed the broad case of it. We have discussed those details as how we would collect, what would happen if, people travel abroad, how would we continue that sort of collection. And yes, we have discussed some options, but again, that's something that once we draw more support, we'll approach as we continue and as we learn more about how much of a success this can be.
But I would add that the class did put out a significant report, much more detailed than anything we can cover today. And if anyone is interested in seeing that report, I'd be really happy to share it with you. Because some of these things, we did spend considerable amount of time thinking, what recommendation would we make? But certainly fair enough, it's to be hashed out in the future.
Hi, Janelle Sorensen, City Club member. Thank you, panel, for a wonderful presentation. A subject that's near and dear to my heart. I'd like to provide you with an unfortunate illustrative example from my own life. I was fortunate enough to graduate from a top-tier law school over 20 years ago. My debt from that remains at over $800 a month. I haven't heard anyone talk about the monthly impact of these huge amounts of debt that one ends up with. Not only that, but at that rate, which I dare say is probably more than some of your mortgages and rents, I am on schedule to complete payments when I'm in my 80s. So although I'm approaching retirement age, retirement is not an option. So obviously that has an impact on the people, the upcoming new and future graduates, because it also impacts job availability, as people who might want to retire are unable to and fewer jobs become available. So I'm encouraged that there seem to be some positive policy changes that might be able to be made to impact future graduates, but I haven't heard anyone talking about what about the old graduates who are still encumbered by this immense debt, as you mentioned. Do you know of anybody working on anything? Nathan mentioned something about revising interest, for example. That would have a tremendous impact. I've looked into everything, and there don't seem to be any options available to retool my loans or do like a loan modification like someone might do with a mortgage. I'm just wondering if there's anything like that in discussion. Thank you.
Do we have anything particular that was on the federal about that?
Yeah, there was something on the federal level about outstanding debts. There was a bill introduced by a congressman out in Michigan named Hanson Clark, who's no longer with the Congress because he's a victim of redistricting. But yeah, there was a plan in there about people with outstanding debts, about a 10-year payment schedule, about capping the interest rate at 3.4%, about if you have, I guess, a history of 120 payments without going into deferment, then you are with a, what's the word I'm thinking of? Default. Without going into default, then you would be applicable to getting forgiveness on the remaining balance. I think up to about $41,700. So that was his idea, and that's the one that I don't even know if it ever made it out of committee, and yeah, just languished and died. So
We do have another couple members of our class with us. I don't know if anybody who was researching those issues wanted to bring anything else up along those lines. No, excellent job, Nathan.
I'm Edward Hershey. I'm a City Club member. Professor King, I'd like you to put on your national expertise hat on this one, if you would. Stories in the Wall Street Journal and Bloomberg News Service have indicated in the past year that across the country, particularly in private higher education, colleges and universities have been willing co-conspirators in this situation, and that higher ed is part of the problem. Not only do they send obfuscatory letters out to people pretending that these loans are actually part of some sort of financial award or grant, but they actually benefit from the loans. And I'm wondering, especially given what President Obama said in his State of the Union address only this past Monday, does higher education have a role to play in reforming itself in this area?
That's an excellent question, and I think you really correctly point out the distinction between the public and the private institutions. They've faced such different circumstances. I think it's certainly true. You can hear a lot of academics concerned about whether or not the availability of private student loans has enabled the private institutions to raise their costs unconscionably and to invest in the kinds of things that are not directly creating better educations. And here we have all the examples of what people call the edifice complex, really great buildings, and we're going to pay our administrators unbelievable amounts and build gorgeous apartments and rock climbing gyms. Now, I'm almost sorry to tell you, you will not find that at Portland State or at your other public universities, but there is a very different set of incentives operating on the private level, and certainly there has been in the past some abuse, some collusion between universities and financiers. I think there's been a significant crackdown, and we really, really insulted our financial aid officer at Portland State by asking him in class what he knew about that. He knows nothing about that. But I would say, there was one point. I think you also do raise really the issue of the amount of these loans and the payments, these terrible kinds of monthly payments that the woman who just raised the question was pointing out, which are going to financial companies. We are really not funneling that back into education, and that's the kind of thing that we would like to cut out.
We have a question from the audience that asks, what can we do to get involved to help push this pay it forward legislation?
Well, you could take a drive to Salem, because you could really go and visit your representative down there in Salem and tell them this is something that you're interested in seeing happen.
Did you want to?
Oh, I'm sorry. That's House Bill 2838.
Thank you.
And even if you can't
Ariel?
make it in person, you know, there are other ways to communicate your support. You know, write letters, send emails, make phone calls, do what you can to make this issue known and have your voices heard so we can get support and we can have this be a success if this is something you want to see happen.
Chris Andre, City Club member. Hearing money sloshing around all over the place. Some of the choice of words makes me see a landscape of technocrats, a two-tiered class system of technocrats at the top. How do you go about leveling the territory between this more, the science, technology, engineering, that business, and people who want to go into more of humanities? In other words, it seems that does your plan take into account the difference between what we mean by education and training?
I would say, thank you for that question, I would say that the people who have been analyzing Pay It Forward have paid a great deal of attention to applying this model to the community colleges and really the range of kinds of training and approaches that people are investing in. It's absolutely suitable for community colleges as well as the range of majors, and people have worked it out for medical school. So I think it's a model that we could apply widely.
Hi everybody, my name is Cameron Witten. I am a member of City Club of Portland. I am a student also studying economics at Portland State University. I'm a junior, and so far I have racked up about $21,000 in student debt. And I think there's a little bit of consensus in this group about a certain question. I know the colleague who's sitting next to me at the table wanted to ask about her son who recently graduated and has $60,000 of debt. And so how can we have a conversation about all of these students who are looking for a way out, a way of support to make this happen? And I know that within the city of Portland, there has been conversation about the Rural Scholars Program, where basically the state would contract out with recent graduates asking for a certain skill set they have to provide for certain regions within the state. And through that, they would actually help pay for whatever student loans that there are. And so I'm asking that after we have this advocacy for developing the pay it forward system, do you recommend that we actually look at a way that we can have the state actually help deal with the loan issue? Because as you said, the biggest problem is when somebody defaults after they're in financial hardship. So what if the state actually came in to take that out in the beginning, make it manageable, and much like the way you refinance the loan, do you think that you would recommend that we had some kind of scholarship program that we could actually even better incentivize making sure people get educated and keep that intellectual resource here within the state? Thank you.
When we were discussing the Pay It Forward program, there was a large emphasis on what it didn't do for people that had outstanding debt. And there was one idea floated around that what if the state could purchase outstanding debts, whereby we would get an immediate cohort of people paying into a Pay It Forward fund. So I guess, I mean, the real question is, if there's a graduate out there with debt, would they be willing to sell it and agree to pay back, 3% of their adjusted gross income for a quarter century? I mean, because I think there would be a lot of people who would.
I'll do it.
It's good to have volunteers. I'm sorry, but we've run out of time for further questions, and we'll have to stop for the day. Please join us next week when Congressman Earl Blumenauer will be addressing the City Club. And as we close for today, please join me in offering our sincere thanks to today's speaker, Ariel Groover, Professor Mary C. King, and Nathan Hunt. We are adjourned.